Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Between Rounds, where it's been a little bit, but you know what? We got a new Deadlock patch, so we got to give you the information that is out there. ZP here with Jake, and Jake, this is a patch where you might look at it and be like, oh, it's a smaller patch, but in reality, a lot has changed.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty significant balance pass. Not some of the huge map reworks that we've seen previously, and some of the fundamental aspects of the game are the same, but quite a few heroes got some pretty significant balance changes. I think a lot of the item changes as well. This would be a great one for folks to review and be able to jump back into the game with a little bit more knowledge.
And without further ado, we're just gonna get right into it. But for me, the interesting part about this is that it really shows like how much of the tuning is being done, especially in the higher end. Because if you've been watching competitive tournaments like Deadlock Fight Night, everything in here, for the most part, is going to make sense from what we've seen. Things that were weak, like really weak, got buffed, and things that have been on top, they got toned down a little bit. So it's clear that Valve is listening. But getting right into it, one of the biggest changes here, Jake, that isn't really a balance thing, but more of a game choice thing, is Soul Orb duplication. It's gone. Things are going to work in a more straightforward way, but it's going to open up opportunities for teams to really, think about how they want to allocate souls in the first 8 minutes of the game now.
Yeah, so I think this is one of those patch notes that could be confusing to some players. So essentially what this means is that, in the previous patch, when you had two players in the lane for the first 8 minutes, you were getting like 200% of the souls available in the lane. So both players were getting full souls in the lane, which meant because of that, in the pre 8 minutes, you basically couldn't leave the lane. I mean, you can, but you're missing out on a massive amount of bounty. It's really inefficient to ever leave the lane pre 8 minutes. And now I think you could be efficient and still send people out of the lane. So if you're winning your lane, you don't necessarily have to full commit on taking the Guardian, which is how the game was almost exclusively played, at least in the first 8 minutes in the last patch. And so now there's an opportunity. You could maybe be winning the lane, send somebody out for a gank, send somebody out to farm some of the early camps or do some box runs. So I think this does open the early game up. And I think that the duplication came in the first place when the roaming was just like almost way too common. Like everyone was roaming 24/7 in the early game in the 4 lane map. But now I think you still have to go quite a bit further in the lanes just due to the map changes. But at least technically you're not being like hard punished on your soul economy for leaving lane. So I think it's going to open up the very early game to a little bit more strategic diversity. And I think that's just going to be, it's going to be fun to watch, honestly, the pros play and see how they approach this. Does this change drafting priority or the way people approach early game? Do they want to get in on those ganks pre 8 minutes?
I also think teams are going to get greedier and greedier on this in terms of trying to figure out how much farm can they funnel to specific characters, right? Like, let's say
Mhm.
you're running a character like Yamato, right? You may be more incentivized to pick a character that doesn't need as much farm necessarily. Like, you could argue a Mo doesn't need as much farm in the early game, right? And let's say you win the lane in the beginning, like the first 3 or 4 minutes. You're more incentivized to have the Mo go out and like grab boxes and get out of the lane for a little bit if you can, to feed even more farm to the Yamato, to try and get like your late game bump going like even earlier. So to me, just seeing how teams will push the envelope and trying to like manipulate the economy of this is going to be really cool.
Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting tweak, to see that you could still kind of go for the Guardian, or you could start roaming,
Yeah.
you do boxes, you could gank, so I think this is gonna, in the just open things up for teams. It'll be exciting to see. But yeah, we'll have to watch, I guess, some more DFN to see how the best players in the world really push the strategy. Because a fundamental change like this is seems subtle and then ends up looking really big once you see the best players in the world and how they change their approach to the game. Getting on to more of these like early laning changes, the wave interval has been increased. So a little bit less often you're going to see the troopers. They're going to be worth a little bit more. So your farm rate is going to be about the same in the end. This does mean, I guess, that there's a little bit more value to like hard shoving the lanes. It's going to be a little bit longer for those troopers to respawn and come defend your towers. So maybe counters a little bit that early change. Maybe people will try to push a little bit more aggressively.
Yeah. Also, parry freezing is gone. We were seeing a little that in
Yeah.
even the last DFN and also in your comp games, as of late, where you just go in front of the melee troopers and you keep parrying them, to freeze them, and get an economic advantage. Yeah, I mean, Valve saw what was going on there. Is like, no, 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 but it's done. It's over.
Yeah, it got a little bit ridiculous. The full freezing in front of the tower. Also, the Guardians have been nerfed a little bit in terms of their ability to just like defend an area, whether via the melee, via the attack range. I think these changes are pretty subtle. Maybe just encourage teams to play aggressive and kind of surround the Guardian and poke from the off angles. We've already seen players really do that, and now maybe you just have a little bit more freedom to get aggressive and maybe threaten some early tower dives if that's what you want to do. The heal trooper no longer having charges. Honestly, I don't know how much this really matters. I think it was just like too hard to keep track of before. Like you never really paid attention to how many heal charges you had left. Now it's going to be a little bit more consistent. Like keeping your heal trooper alive is going to give you a lot of resource throughout the lane, especially with that 6-second cooldown. I think this is actually pretty interesting because I think this incentivizes you to push lanes and try to kill the enemy medic trooper as quickly as possible, because this is going to be putting down really a ton of HP into the lane. If their medic trooper is up and they're just constantly farming it and standing on it, getting tons of heals, you're really going to fall behind in the lane. So I think this also punishes the concept of like playing super passive and freezing the lane under tower, because a team that kills your medic trooper and pushes with theirs just going to have a lot more fighting power.
Medic Trooper now is the best healer in the game, at least in the early part of the game. Now, one interesting thing to me is, kind of skipping ahead here and not going like ultra deep in the every change, but the Earn change is really interesting because the reason why Earn wasn't immediately viewable on the minimap when people picked it up is that there was an error in Deadlock, right? Where overall, players weren't necessarily running the Earn as much. It wasn't as prioritized. So one of the ways of making the Earn more attractive to run was giving you this period of invisibility to, set up with. But now in the 3-lane map, that change was kind of archaic, right? Like everyone is contesting the Earn no matter what right now. And as a result, you have the case here where you don't necessarily need to give the team that picks up the Earn an even greater advantage by keeping you invisible after picking it up, because there's no worry that it won't be contested. It will be.
Yeah, I think this is like a reflection of the fact that the competitive metagame has really started to revolve around the Earn being that crucial mid-game objective where you can really start to escalate your advantage or force fights earlier without needing to siege an enemy tower that like adds so much power to the enemy if you fight under it. So I think this is definitely a good change based on the way the competitive game has shifted. I also like just like quality of life change that you can see if it's a side favored drop off for the Earn. I think that's really nice, because before it was like you're not quite sure if you're above or below the threshold. You got to pick the Earn up. Oh, and you see, okay, I actually don't want to do this one. It's a difficult drop off. It's a little bit annoying. So I think just those are like the type of tweaks that we're going to expect to see a lot of in Deadlock. But still, good to see the devs are constantly pushing the envelope and trying to find new ways to make the game just a little bit more straightforward and accessible.
Also, I love that they remove the Earn stalling, as it were. If you go back a few DFNs, the last time Naked and LARP Lords played, there was a moment where we had about like 30 seconds on camera of Naked just standing in front of the Earn, and the Earn slowing down, being like, "You got to pick me up," and it just kept going and going and going. So now the Earn, they added a little bit of timer to that, going, okay, the Earn will wait a little bit, but we're not going to do this like 5-minute stall of the Earn barely moving across the map.
Yeah, I think this is also just nice because it really means like if you're gonna hold the Earn, you do have to actually hold it. You can't just stall it forever, which also is going to be revealing you on the map, which creates an opportunity for the opponents to counterplay. So I think all these changes are good, just like more quality of life balance changes, and like we can move past the Earn. Heavy melee cancel momentum is significantly reduced. I actually think this is an important change. I think the fleet foot cancel, it was just too good. Like I get it that it's like not necessarily a bad thing to have in the game, but it was like one of the strongest movement tools in the entire game, even better than most heroes that like have movement skills. Heavy melee cancel was still better than that. So I think it was in need of a bit of a tuning with how many characters were building items just to go for this play, and how consistent it gave like heroes like Abrams ridiculous mobility.
Also, is probably one of the most lobbied against things. I mean, it was very divisive. There were a lot of supporters of HMC being like, it's cool movement tech, leave it in the game. But there was a period of time, a few months back, where my DMs were just flooded, especially for players from EU that were saying, we are signing a petition that we want you to send to Valve, saying that we want HMC removed from the game. It's like, guys, I'm just helping run a tournament right now, and this is, the game balance part is a little bit out of my department, but I mean, on the high end, there was a lot of people that just wanted HMC to go away. And in this case, it just feels like they decided to hit a little bit of a middle ground where they're going to leave it in, but now it's like more of a bonus if you're running Fleetfoot anyways, as opposed to you must run it for a, very crucial escape skill or initiation, depending on, how you're using it.
Yeah, it's just sort of uncounterable, I think, is part of the problem. Whereas, like, your stamina is something that's like a core part of the game. People understand that, people can work with that. But the ability to just like go warp speed on like a cooldown is a little bit too crazy. And honestly, Fleetfoot's such a cool item. You don't want to like be nerfing Fleetfoot and reworking that. I think the HMC probably did need to just be toned down. And I like that, this is good for Valve. Like they're not destroying it. They're not going to take it away, but they're going to significantly reduce it. I'm curious to see how it looks in game, because I still think a lot of heroes, if you're going to build the fleet foot, if you're, if you want that item in your build, you can probably still go for this tech quite a bit. It's just not like you're not forced to build fleet foot because you can do this tech. It's not
Yeah.
really forcing your build, which I think is a little bit more of a healthy spot for the item and for the strategy.
Yeah, good bonus, but not meta defining as it was before. In all likelihood, but we'll see how it shakes out. But moving on here, a little bit of AI fixes. Nothing too huge here, but there are moments where you'd get chased by a trooper and it actually would get you killed. Where it's just like, wait, why is this thing still on me? How does it know where I am? And they just made him a little bit dumber here.
Yeah, I think this is good. Like you a lot of times get troopers in crazy spots, like taking weird angles because they're chasing a player. Being buggy in the base. So I think all these troopers would fear really steep stairs. Yeah. So I mean, look, we all see the trooper AI is a little wonky at times, not super noticeable, but this is like more of those core fundamental changes. I don't think these really shift the balance at all. I think this is just a pure quality of life that things are going to be a little bit more consistent when it comes to the troopers.
Now we come to the item changes where, I mean, a lot of this is just general tuning.
Hmm.
There are a few very, very big changes here, but, the first half of the changes here generally make sense. I mean, Divine Barrier and Restorative Locket getting hit a little bit, probably the biggest things of note, but also they're getting built by almost everyone because
Yeah.
of the early game value. And look, on one hand, in the hands of a skilled player, like activatable items will always sort of have like a slight edge because they kind of have to if you're making their stat benefit like dependent on proper timing, but it was probably a little bit too generous and a little bit too often given how much everyone was building them.
Yeah, some subtle nerfs. Things like I think healing right getting a bit of a nerf is interesting. It's still such a strong sustain item. And has such value even like in the mid game to be able to like keep you farming a little bit more when you're doing camps and roaming around the map. So Hollow Point Ward getting a minor nerf. I don't think these changes are really that huge. I think the Enchanter barrier probably did also need a nerf with how commonly it was being built. It's just giving the cooldown resist and or cooldown reduction rather and spirit power so good. Same for combat barrier. I think a lot of heroes were really building the shield double shield build, even a lot of them, or just like these are being built. Almost everyone's building one or the other, except for like a couple characters. So I think these being nerfed is nice.
Oh,
Debuff producer also being nerfed. I mean, this is just. I think this is just cool to see. Like a lot of the items that had become almost perma buys are getting nerfed a little bit, getting taken down, which creates an opportunity for new builds to rise and new item strategies to come up.
also, Fortitude getting hit is kind of interesting because there was a period where Fortitude kept getting buffed and it still wasn't being used for a while. But I think the shift into the 3-lane map kind of brought us to a point where it's like, oh, wait, like actually having regen without going back to base is good. It's a little bit harder to get on the zip lines. And also with the new jungle, right? Like just being able to be around and like have more uptime without going back to base actually way more directly correlates with more farms. So I think Fortitude is one of those things where everything changed around it and it became really, really good. And now it's just, bring it back a little bit.
It's a pretty nice knockdown buff actually, because I think a lot of the time people were, when you get knocked down, you're like jumping and sliding and like okay, you get stunned, but you're still moving, and it really doesn't destroy your position that hard if you have some movement skills to help you escape it. But now knockdown is gonna, I think, do a little bit better at its job of like punishing those flyers, anyone who's over relying on being up in the air and really punish them. Like really, like losing all your momentum is a big deal in Deadlock, especially with a knockdown stun. So I think this will be nice with how strong heroes like Great Talon and Vindicta have proven themselves to be. Having a little bit more consistency on the knockdown, making it a stronger punishing tool will be nice for sure. And then I think this is probably the biggest change of all the item changes is the Ethereal Shift change. So tier 3 to tier 4 is a huge nerf, right? It's like basically more doubling the cost. And yes, it's a little bit better with in terms of like its raw effects that you can cancel it early is quite nice. The slightly longer duration, you can move a little bit more, significantly more. Actually, I mean, 50% faster, right? When you're in the E shift. However, costing twice as much is a game changer. I think you probably won't be seeing this item build all that much. It reminds me of Veilwalker when it was 3K and then went to double that. We still see Veilwalker like here and there. We see it on some Holliday players building it as they're going in and out looking for kills, but it became like from what was a like an item built on like 2/3 of the game, I think that's where E-Shift had gotten to the point where realistically you could see 12 E-Shifts in a game of high level deadlock and you wouldn't really be that surprised. So I think that item clearly needed a real fundamental rework, and moving from tier 3 to tier 4 is that rework.
Also, I do wonder if this is gonna have a wider impact on the meta and bring frontliners a little bit more into focus. Just because
Mm,
you think about like a lot of the
yeah.
current tier list, right? And like the heroes that rely on E shift the most are more in the playmaking level of heroes. Heroes that are more essentially they're a little bit squishier, but they would use E shift to get out of bad situations. Even characters like Vindicta and Talon, right, would usually use E shift quite a bit. And now the fact you're making E shift way more expensive, now you have to wonder, okay, does it make more sense just to get something that's, more outright tanky and less likely to need an emergency button? Because this level of expense, some heroes still may get it, but you're giving up way, way more power for what in many cases will effectively be the same effect. So I'm really curious to see what this does to the pick priority in the next fight night, just because I do think a lot may change as a result of this.
Yeah, and then a small cooldown increase to Echo Shard. Not crazy changes, but I like that they're taking down some of the power on some of the strongest items across. I think across the board, these are all nerfs. I guess the knockdown is a buff, but pretty much everything else is getting nerfed. So a lot of the strongest, most commonly built items being toned down a little bit. I think it's just always interesting to see what new builds come out of this, and as you mentioned, ZP, how this affects like your overall hero pick priority, the way you see the game as a whole.
All right, so moving on, as we now got the hero changes. And again, a lot of these changes should not surprise you, but some are pretty severe. I mean, you look at the Bebop changes here,
These are big
and
nerfs, like very
yeah,
big nerfs.
losing one stamina bar is actually massive early on. And I think the general trend to a lot of these changes overall was hitting heroes more in the early to mid game. But that also makes sense because you take a look at what teams have been preferring at the top level. For the most part, it has been a very heavy bias towards winning the game in really the first like 12 to 15 minutes. So the fact that all these high level picks basically got hit on their early game potential is big, right? Because you look at something like stamina, you can compensate for lower stamina with items deeper into the game. But in the laning phase, you're going to feel the loss of one stamina bar like more acutely than any other point in the game. It hurts Bebop's ability to get out of trouble. It hurts his ability to chase down if he does get a hook, where you think about it, right? You hook in a character that may have like 3 or 4 stamina bars after an item, and they just try and get away post hook. Bebop having only 2 natively is going to have way harder of a time of finishing off some of these kills if they're not basically dead from the hook to begin with. So you're going to get a lot of those situations where Bebop will go, wow, this would have went differently pre-nerf.
Yeah, I think Bebop as well, like with the pre 8 minute splitting change, would have been almost too insane, right? I think like in terms of the heroes that want to roam pre 8 minutes, Bebop's probably one of the best gankers in the game, right? With the ability to show up and hook somebody is like, yeah, like if you're showing up into you're adding an extra player into the lane that early with a hook, like if you hit the hook there, you're just gonna get guaranteed kills off of it. So Bebop, I think, needed a little bit of an extra nerf, and already I think had established as one of the stronger heroes in this meta. Same story for Calico, who's getting a pretty significant nerf. Base ammo being taken down mitigates some of her incredible early last hitting potential. The gun damage growth limits some of the scaling, and people were doing a lot of like gun scaling builds on Calico as well. And the Gloom Bombs T1 and T2 swap. So it's just like mitigating some of the power of these. Like, I mean, both Bebop and Calico have been like S tier top picks in the last few weeks of DFN. So I'm excited to see that. Great talent as well. Another, I mean, probably decisively one of the top carry heroes in terms of like the raw damage dealing, especially on the early game laning potential for Great Talon. Getting the HP regen reduced hurts the laning. The charge shot changes are ultimately all about the early game, like you were saying, ZP, before the show, that like, okay, once you have the T3 spirit scaling, which you're probably going to be maxing charge shot most of the time anyway, and Great Talent's your main damage source, so like you're going to be just fine into the late game. However, I think the move speed spirit scaling is actually a really big change, because on Great Talent, you were pretty much building pure spirit damage, right? Like you could go full glass cannon when you're playing this hero and just be all in on your nuking potential, because that was also giving you move speed, right? When you're building like hundreds and hundreds of spirit, this move speed starts to get really, really significant. And I think taking that down a notch means, okay, like catching the Great Talent is now going to be more achievable. And when you have this much damage potential, you can't have the best move speed in the lobby too, right? Like that's just out
No,
of
no.
control in the
Well,
late game.
and here's what's going to change his placement. Not only is his early game worse, but on top of it, now you stop and think of it with the E shift change. He's going to be slower with less move speed because of the spirit change. And in most games, probably won't have E shift, or if he does go E shift, it's going to be way later into the game. The end
Mhm.
result is that Talon is going to be dying way more often than he does in the current patch. So you add everything together, full picture wise, I think Talon's overall valuation will be going down.
Yeah, definitely. These are some nerfs. I feel like the talent could still work, could still be strong, but maybe it had reached a little bit of a inflection point in terms of being that like permanent top pick or always getting first ban, especially with the value that the owl brings in the early game. I will say also like maybe owling in the early game is not as super critical because great talent could like you don't have to leave the lane. You're still getting efficient souls because you're not splitting, but you're sending your bird as a way to roam. And now, okay, like you could actually just pick heroes that just roam pre 8 minutes and it's not as costly. So that could also, from a meta perspective, hurt great talent.
Haze changes. I mean, we'll see where it goes. I don't think this really is going to change Haze too much on the top end. I feel like Haze is one of those characters where it's really easy to put her over the top to where everyone wants to pick her. But I don't know if these changes here really hit where she's been weak at in terms of being a real big, the game is still very early the mid lane focused, and Haze's top end is still nowhere near as good as the really high end heroes for what they do when farmed, like, say Yamato, right? So yeah, I look at the Haze changes here. It's like, this is probably the first salvo of things Haze will need to get back up into, a higher pick rate for me.
Yeah, I agree in the sense that I don't think Haze is going to be like a top tier meta hero with these changes, but honestly, I think they're actually a pretty solid start. I think we could see maybe a little
Mhm.
bit more Haze picks, especially with the pre 8 minute roaming. Haze is actually pretty great at roaming
Yeah.
very early on in the game, especially with the nuking stamina regeneration for 6 seconds is pretty huge because now like you come in, you gank somebody and you're going to be able to chase them down. You're going to be able to stay on top of them because they're just not going to have the stamina to escape you unless they have really, really powerful movement tools in their kit. So I think we could see Haze playing, off that early game snowball ganking play style. And even like before your ulti is online, all you really need is invis, like kind of like all three main skill, your base skills online, and I think you could start to become a ganking threat on Haze. So I think this is doable. Like you said, VP, I think there's still some challenges for Haze to be played at the top level, but these are pretty good changes, and I feel like Haze to me, like once you hit like a crazy scaling potential, sometimes the ult does start to get really wild and you can, be really difficult to answer. So I'm I'm a little bit more bullish on Hayes than you are, but I agree. I don't know that this makes her a top tier pick. I think this just like opens it up where okay, maybe we can start playing Hayes again. Maybe some of the pro teams are going to come out with some strats here and there, but I agree. It's probably going to be picked later into drafts, maybe as like a way to punish certain heroes or take a certain early to mid game play style.
One thing that I will say that occurred to me that's really funny is imagine being a Bebop player where you don't know about the changes and you come in with one less stamina and then you lane versus a Haze and get hit by a dagger and you're like, I can't move. What is going on right now? Like all the stamina's gone. But moving along here. Some of the other changes here, again, as expected, and not massive, but again, kind of an idea of like, okay, we want to start slowly bringing heroes down. And Holliday has been one of the very, very top picks. So you take a look here, base damage going up, but base damage going down and growth going up. This is purely a Holliday. We think you're too good in the early game, so we're gonna tone it down a little bit.
Yeah, and Holiday is such an effective like catch hero and ganker. It's like, does she really need to have great gun scaling? Like that's a little too much. That you're not only a CCer and like a ganker and a catch hero, but also you're a relevant damage dealer with your gun in the late game. Okay, like that needs to come down a little bit. So losing some of the growth is big. Losing some of the early lane pressure is big. Also, they fixed the heavy melee lasso cancel, which is pretty big in the early game for adding quite a significant amount of damage to that combo. And of course, if you're lasting somebody, they're not going to be able to parry you. So um, just a lot of mitigation on Holiday, who was also one of those like super top tier picks in DFN, had really risen to the top in terms of these initiators, was getting first banned a lot. So maybe this means we'll actually might see a little bit more Holiday because people will be less
Yeah.
focused on always first banning this hero as we saw in so many games at DFN.
Emo Ivy, a little bit harder to hit on the head, but otherwise a-okay. So Ivy escaping nerfs, which makes sense because she hasn't been as highly valued recently.
He still looked
That
good though. I mean,
yeah,
I think this
She
could
did get
be
played
a good
in one
moment
of
for
her
Ivy. I
games.
mean, this is such a small buff. Yeah, you don't want to overemphasize it, but I do think she had started to see a little bit more playtime. We could see more teams try to bring her out a little bit more. I don't like maybe I'm just maybe this change is like a nothing burger though. It's like a 1%, 0.01% buff overall to the hero, mitigating I guess how much headshots you take in the lane. Um, but yeah, still good for her. And I think she was already on kind of an uptrend. I think teams had started to figure out how to get a little bit more mileage out of the Ivy.
Then moving along, Kelvin, again, same theme here of, not trying to really hit him too much in the mid to late game, but definitely trying to just hit him again in the early game where he's going to be more harassable from abilities in the early laning phase because, he'll get up to the same spirit resistance later in the game, but early game, way more vulnerable and also frozen shelter, a bit less spammable.
Yeah, and losing some base sprint mitigates some of those early game roaming potentials. And I think this is important with Kelvin already being one of the better roamers in the early game with the ice path. Okay, now like your sprint is also nerfed a little bit. So if you're gonna run a roam on Kelvin and show up into another lane, that's just gonna be a little bit more expensive in terms of the time it takes. I also think Kelvin's early laning was so dominant, especially in a few of these combos, like slowing people down, setting up another hero to deal damage, so powerful. You do scale a little bit better into the late game in theory, right? You're going to be able to get quite a lot of spirit resist when you get a lot of boons, but also Kelvin's not usually going to be doing the sinner sacrifices very much, maybe doing some of the golden statues, but I guess this gives a bit more optionality or a bit more thought to be had about, do you want to have your Kelvin scale a little bit better? Still, I think probably not. I think you're probably still playing for the support, but yeah, those early mid games, especially with the frozen shelter early game, slowing down the tempo on that. I mean, it's so ridiculously powerful to just like 2v1 inside the frozen shelter early game feels like guaranteed kills 90% of the time. So yeah, having that be on a little bit longer cooldown when you first get the skill, okay, makes a lot of sense to me.
Moving right along to our next batch of changes. Geist, just a bug fix. Don't have to go there. Where I mean, look, that was an annoying bug when it happened. So hey, that's where it goes. Lash, it's kind of interesting on the changes here. I feel like this one definitely has to be more based on internal data rather than more competitive side because like Lash really hasn't been picked that much competitively. But I think there's definitely levels of play, especially like earlier in the MMRs where Lash is still probably quite strong.
Yeah, and then Death Slam time gives a little bit more opportunity for counterplay. So some of these heroes like Bebop and Holliday that could like kind of grab Lash while he's ulting and try to punish him, maybe have a little bit larger window for that. Other heroes, pretty good. I also think, to be fair, E Shift was like part of the reason that Lash was
Yeah.
so hard to play because you just E Shift his ultimate, and it's like, okay, he just wastes his ultimate if you E Shift, and there's not really much he can do about it. Well, now it's like, okay, way less people are going to be buying E Shift. Maybe this would have benefited Lash. I don't know how deep in the theory craft that is, but I think we
No.
like in the net. Also with like roaming early game being potentially a little bit stronger. I think these are relatively modest nerfs to Lash, and I do think the overall changes to the game are actually seem to me to be pretty good for Lash.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, especially at E-Shift being his bane. And also, I feel like this is going to be the first of many, but we have hit the point where, I think it's just hit full awareness that McGinnis has not been good. So
Yeah.
now, big
All
turret
right.
buffs coming on in.
The turret McGinnis build, I like. All right, 18-second duration is crazy. You're gonna be able to build so many turrets. I mean, someone's got to make a video where you buy like all the cooldown reduction items and just see how many turrets you can have up at once, like in the mid boss. It's gonna be heinous, man. You're gonna have like 10 turrets out or something absolutely absurd to like defend a certain area or like solo the mid boss. I think is actually pretty realistic. I think this is actually like that tier 3 is low key kind of crazy. So I think this could open up McGinnis to be played again with, especially with the buffs to the turrets fundamentally. I'm a little worried. I mean, the fear is that the turrets, they still do like feed souls, but man, like you could hit a scaling point where you could start like sieging objectives, you could fight around urns. Like I feel like I mean that 18 seconds is like deceptively huge. The problem is you have to know where you're going to fight pretty far ahead of time in order to like really get the nest online. And you definitely need a few items to really make it relevant. But I think this could start to get kind of scary, ZP. I think like the crazy amount of turret McGinnis build is low key pretty strong. In especially if your team's fighting around those turrets and really playing for them, could be effective. I could see this maybe coming a little bit back into the meta.
All right. Well, the early indicator there will be is Naked playing McGinnis again. If the answer is yes, it's back on the menu. But moving along here, Mirage. I mean, again, just kind of baseline. We're toning him down a bit. Has been like one of the most reliable top picks in the game for ages, and you know, I just feel like the cycle of like slowly turning down Mirage continues, but still, to me, going to be a top pick.
Yeah, I mean, these are all pretty subtle changes. Hurts the early laning just a little bit, but in the end, at a certain point, you had the global TP, the farming potential of this hero is still incredibly strong. I think you're right, though. At some point, it'll be like the straw that broke the camel's back. But with how good Mirage is right now and how small these changes are, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think this is going to be it. It just maybe makes him a little bit less OP, a little bit less dominant, especially in pubs.
Same deal for Mo, where Mo getting hit in the early game, which let's see, scroll down. Are those all the changes for Mo and Krill, by the way? I think so, but just you know,
I
see where
believe
it's at
that's
right now.
it. I mean, I think
Yeah.
reducing some of the combo DP, I think these changes, I guess these hurt in like pubs where you're a little bit more dependent on the Mo and Curl solo damage, but Mo is, I mean, I think the combo damage just doesn't really matter in high level. It's all about your teammates following up and shooting somebody who's hard stunned in a position, right? I guess this mitigates some of the potential for Mo to like individually start snowballing and be like a huge threat ganking in the early game. Um, maybe another one of those heroes who you want to pick Mo for the potential to roam across the map with Burrow and kind of show up in those early lanes pre 8 minutes, maybe that you wouldn't have done before. Mo was also, in fairness, I think really rising in popularity, and people had started to, really push the play style and not only have an early laning dominance, but then snowball into a lot of those mid game ganks and get a lot of pickoffs that even when you're behind in the game, I think Mo was one of the best heroes for making those comeback, getting that guaranteed pickoff with the help of some teammates in a combo.
Moving along here, Paradox again, slight nerf to the overall roaming ability. The interesting thing here, though, I'll kind of glance over the Paradox stuff and go directly into the pocket changes here because it's kind of interesting where they hit his early game again and they tried to compensate in the mid game, but we went through a period where Pocket was untouched for a long time, and people just all of a sudden realized, wait, Pocket's really good. Pocket's still actually really good, guys, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, do we have to hit him again? And the answer was yes.
Yeah, I think it puts a little bit more pressure to level the satchel, and pocket points are really at a premium. I mean, you really want all your skills to be leveled up as quickly as possible. So making it, rely a little bit more on those points, hit a little bit more scaling, that does slow down some of that early game. And then I think pocket just should be a super spirit damage focused character. So nerfing the bullet damage makes a lot of sense, gives you another angle to deal with the pocket. It's just building the debuff removers, building spirit resist, and you're not going to have to worry quite as much about the shotgun threat in the early to mid game. The scaling is not massive, but I think that's kind of deceptive, right? Like he's losing,
Yeah.
what is that? So it's like an eighth of his bullet damage scaling. It's like a 15% nerf on just the scaling, which is pretty serious when it comes to like late game bullet damage. It's going to actually have quite a big effect when you're like very deep in the levels. So Pocket is going to be a little bit more tunneled on spirit damage. I mean, he already was, but even more so now.
Yeah, and the 7 change, pretty minor. Just Stormcloud was one of the newer additions to the hero, and they go, okay, well, we'll tone it down a little bit, but give it a little bit more range. Kind of focusing more on the utility aspect of it, if nothing else, with the like
Yeah.
higher range, lower damage.
Doesn't change much for me. I think more and more at the top level, the 7 ulti is you're still really nice, still really useful, but you really want to be fighting with that third scale and just being like a highly mobile damage dealer. So the ulti now, yeah, I just think, yeah, it's kind of like give a little, take a little. I think this is a slight nerf because before I felt like I didn't ever have a problem hitting like the AoE of players I wanted to hit. So maybe, doesn't radically reshape things, just reduces some of the instant nuking threat, like ulting somebody and instantly nuking. I mean, they like to finish off a kill in the early game was pretty strong. So, yeah, maybe a little bit less explosive. You got to play for that Stormcloud to make it harder for the enemies to escape it.
Sinclair, I mean, this isn't too surprising, even though I think like how often he's prioritized at the top end is pretty variable based on the team. But he has been pretty good, and when he has been good, it has been more in the early game. So again, you see changes more directed towards there, but also in general, just some overall power nerfs coming in.
Wow, wait a minute. Is this true? So Rabid Hex damage amp didn't affect allied damage. That was how it didn't work properly before.
Yeah, and that
This
actually is
is
interesting. I glossed over that. That
Sinclair
may.
looked so good before this. I just assumed the damage amp was working because looked so good to virtual. I mean, even though they nerfed the damage amp quite a lot, the fact that it wasn't working on your allies before makes this really scary, right? Like that the damage amp is such a powerful aspect of the skill, and it is heavily nerfed in fairness across the board. So Sinclair himself solo killing people is like massively nerfed, which is probably kind of the bigger problem for the hero. But this does also improve the threat of like Rabbit Hex into team focus fire in the late game, especially when you have duration extenders and like they're hex for such a long time, you could really punish them. I do think the bullet damage nerf is massive for the laning threat. Have to see. I guess you get the Rabbit Hex no longer deals damage. It increases move speed a little bit more. So they've taken a lot away from Sinclair. And in the end, I'm not convinced that the bug fix actually is going to overwhelm that. I guess the real problem I think Sinclair was just like Rabbit Hex into getting solo killed by Sinclair. That was like the really annoying thing, especially in pubs. It was just so ridiculously powerful, and being chain stun forever sucks. So they've really drastically nerfed that. And even if
it also doesn't do any damage on top of it either, like like across the board,
which, like, come on, it didn't need to deal damage. It was so strong.
It already turned you into a rabbit. Yeah, I mean, overall, there's a world where a few niche situations where the damage amp like will compensate for some of this in the late game, like team fights, if you have like a big damage threat, hitting someone at the same time. But overall, it definitely really hurts again the mid game, especially, which has been the
laning was sort of the ridiculous power level from Sinclair. The just early laning, hexing people in the early lane was so ridiculous for follow-up melees, for like team to the fact that there's no counterplay unless other than having the mobility to get out of the hex. But well, let's move on to the next change. Is there it? I think is there anything else?
Well, we got a few left,
more.
But
there it is.
Yeah. Again, Vindicta just getting hit ever so slightly, particularly the shred, where this is one thing that you talk with top players, I've mentioned a lot, where the idea of like, look, you definitely need to get like forms of shred into your lineup. People tend to underrate it, and actually the effectively 50% nerf to or not 50%, it's like 40-ish percent, whatever. I'll math later, but it's still a very significant difference to the shred percentage from Vindicta. You might look at it as like, oh, it's only you take a look at it's only 4. It's like,
shred. I mean, shred is powerful because it's effectively like a damage amp for your entire team, right? So 4% damage for the entire team is quite significant. I agree. I don't think the change is like that massive. The cooldown being a little bit longer reduces some of the harassment potential. But yeah, Vindicta was also reaching a pretty high level in terms of pick rate, was quite popular, in both regions, really, in NA and EU, in DFN. So these are relatively small changes, but now, yeah, like you mentioned, maybe a little bit more pressure to buy items like Crippling Headshot. You can't rely as much on Vindicta to provide that shred. And Warden finally getting some love. I feel Warden had really fallen off, was a dominant hero for quite a long time, but ever since the 3-lane change, just barely being played, just here and there, and not looking super strong. So base health, base regen, and being unable to blink or item TP out of the binding word capture is a pretty big deal. But honestly, the regen base regen is really nice for the laning phase. Like for Warden getting pressured in the laning phase, a little bit more HP, a little bit more regen. These changes are really good for Warden's weakest moment of the game. Really is like the very start of the game, the laning. Like once you hit scaling with Gun Warden, you do start to get pretty strong. But the very early laning, I felt he was so weak, and that has become so important to the game these days. I think that's partly why he wasn't being played so much. So I wonder if this regen and HP change are just maybe enough to get a little bit more play in the early lanes. Maybe it's not quite as much of a sacrifice to have a Warden.
I think he's going to be helped out a lot because a lot of the other really big early to mid-game heroes got nerfed. E-Shift got nerfed, which is going to make people rely more on heroes that don't die as easily to begin with. And also, I mean, again, you look at Vindicta, for example, right? Losing some of the shred and also losing E-Shift at the same time. I think you add all this together, and it's way more likely that heroes like Warden will benefit, but time will tell.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Without the E-Shift was such a strong counter to something like Binding Word, or even the ulti from Warden, right? Like you get caught in it while you pop E-Shift, you wait him out. Warden hates to be waited out. Could be, potentially some gank threat from Warden in the early game, although I think he does need usually a little bit more farm. I think pre-8 minutes is a little ambitious for Warden going for ganks. But yeah, these are across the board. I mean, I think these are all good changes, make a lot of sense, as you were mentioning, ZP, from what we've been seeing in high level Deadlock. But that wraps it up there. That's the passion. I think this will be a fun one to jump into and just see with all these different hero changes. I think it'll feel fresh. We'll get to see some maybe players experimenting with different picks again. Curious to see if McGinnis makes a reappearance. I mean, she hasn't been played in a long time in competitive Deadlock. So this would be, I kind of hope somebody shows us some crazy turret build. I think that would be fun to watch. It'd be cool to see maybe these top McGinnis players experiment with what they can do on the hero.
I mean, you talk about people entering the bog. It's kind of a different cut to that where it's like, okay, we're going to chase over. It's like, wait, the McGinnis put how many turrets near the urn turn in? Look, it could be a thing. Lots of stuff in flux here. And look, you know, you want to see how it all pans out? Join us next Wednesday for Deadlock Fight Night as we'll see it all take place.
Yeah, that's it for us here on the patch review. Thanks for watching between rounds. You can subscribe to the channel, ring the bell to see when we drop the new videos. Let us know in the comments what else you want to see here on the podcast. And just thanks for watching. It helps us out.